to the panel on anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, how to identify and what to do. Welcome to everybody in the room and everybody watching on the live stream. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Shaya, Lerner. I am ADL's Director of Israel Affairs. And it's really, as you know, no secret that there's been a significant uptick in anti-Semitic incidents over the past few years, both in the United States and around the world. And I just want to run through some statistics to kind of set the stage for today's conversation. So our ADL's 2021 audit of anti-Semitic incidents showed that there were 2,717 incidents across the US, which was a 34% increase from 2020. And it is the highest number that ADL has ever recorded. During the month of May 2021, which as you all probably remember, there was a conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The numbers were particularly high. In that month, there were 387 incidents, which marked a 141% increase over the same period from May of 2020. College campuses, university campuses in particular, were a hotbed of anti-Israel activity. During the 2021-2022 academic year, ADL tallied 359 campus anti-Israel incidents. Many of those, not all, but many of those were anti-Semitic in nature. And the truth is this phenomenon is unfortunately not limited just to the United States. In the United Kingdom, where one of our panelists is from, ADL's partner, the CST, recorded 2,255 anti-Semitic incidents in 2021, which is the highest total ever recorded by the CST, and that marked a 34% increase from 2020. Of those incidents, 661 alone were from May 2021 during the Israel-Hamas conflict, which was the highest monthly statistics ever recorded. So as these statistics have shown, and we've all come to either experience directly or anecdotally, attacks on Israel and Zionism have become much more intertwined with anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionist rhetoric has become mainstreamed in certain segments of society, especially in progressive spaces. And attacks are no longer limited to Israel as an entity. It used to be that a lot of the attacks were directed at Israel as a state. Now, those attacks are directed at supporters or perceived supporters of Israel, which is really the case about most Jews. Zionists have become the new villains in this narrative. Zionism is often used as a code or a stand-in for Jews. Israel is no longer just a problematic country. It is now an apartheid state, a state engaging in genocide, in ethnic cleansing. And these are labels that have traditionally been reserved for the worst actors in history, and they're being now applied to Israel. That is, of course, not to say that all attacks or criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and truthfully, many are not. Many are just acceptable forms of criticism. And that's really what brings us to today's conversation. We're going to spend some time today with my three panelists unpacking some scenarios based on real-world events. And I'm going to ask our panelists to share their views about the scenarios and explain how they approach each one. Before we do that, though, I'm going to ask each one to very briefly lay out how they might differentiate between expressions that are anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic. After that, we'll move on to the scenario sessions. And following that, I'm going to also ask for the panelists to briefly talk about a specific issue related to Israel and Zionism that they themselves have dealt with, and then finally we will conclude with questions. Before I begin, though, I'm going to very quickly introduce everyone. Their full bios are on the app, but to my immediate left is Marie van der Zyl, who is the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Next to her is Matt Berger, who is the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. And to his left is Meredith Weisel, who is ADL's director in our Washington, D.C. office.
And you are?
I already said that at the beginning. My name is Shaya Lerner. I'm the director of Israel Affairs.
Can you define what the difference is?
We're gonna talk about that. So to begin, I'm gonna actually ask Marie, can you please differentiate between expressions that are anti-Israel, that are anti-Zionist, and that are anti-Semitic?
Thank you, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you for your welcome. I really appreciate it.
It's really difficult to answer that question in a straightforward way, but I think the best way is to go to the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And we know that if people say anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism, comments very, very quickly cross the line into anti-Semitism, holding the world's oldest state being collectively responsible for every ill. And we know that criticism of Israel alone, that is not something that's forbidden by IRA. So I think it's very important that we've worked globally to try and implement the IRA definition, whether it's across campus, our local authorities, because we know that anti-Semitism has to be tackled globally and with partners. So I think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because it very, very quickly crosses into that narrative. It's very difficult to police it, but commenting about Israel, we do it all the time. One Jew, 10 opinions, everyone's a prime minister. So that sort of criticism of Israel alone isn't enough. But holding Israel responsible for every collective ill clearly is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Marie. Matt, would you like to share?
I think what's interesting here is that these are three terms that have academic distinctions, but when you really think about how these issues play out, they're becoming more and more intertwined. Yes, you can have an incident that is anti-Israel or in opposition to Israeli policy that isn't anti-Semitic or isn't anti-Zionist. Yes, you can be a Jew or someone who supports the Jewish community who doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist as a state. Maybe you don't believe in, maybe you're John Lennon and, imagine there's no countries. There are ways academically that you can distinct between these three things. But what we're seeing is that they are blending in everyday life. That opposition to Israeli policy and opposition to Israeli action, particularly around the Palestinians, has become a proxy for speaking out against Zionism and speaking out against Israel's right to exist as a state. And the attacks against Israel are attacking American Jews in a way that is anti-Semitic, and holding American Jews accountable for the actions of the Israeli government is really the anti-Semitism that we see that is being defined by adversaries as, no, that's just legitimate criticism of Israel. And so we have to recognize that while there are distinctions, you can attack and speak out against the policy of Israel and still be a Zionist. You can have opposition to Israel as a Jewish state and still support the Jewish community. That's not what's happening when you look at a college campus. They are quickly becoming one and the same, and the way it is manifesting is attacks on American Jews for not just their support of Zionism, not just their support of Israeli policy, but the perception that because they are a Jew, they hold certain beliefs about Israel and certain affinity towards Israel. That is the anti-Semitism that we're seeing today.
Great, thank you. Meredith?
So the approach I'm going to take is looking at it as ADL, how we look at it and how we look at it in the community, particularly our regional offices when we're working on things in the community. So just straightforward definition, when we're talking about anti-Semitism and when we do trainings, we talk about it as a form of prejudice that's directed towards Jews as individuals or as a group. We look at it when we see things based on stereotypes, a lot of the old age myths, things related to Jews as a people, to their religious practices and beliefs. A lot of it comes from historical tropes that we now see contemporarily manifesting. When we talk about anti-Israel, though, it's very, my answer is going to be very similar to my panelists. We're talking about anti-Israel bias that is inaccurate in many ways. It is hyperbolic. It is criticism of Israel. When you start bleeding into anti-Semitism is when you're not just criticizing policies of the government, you are essentially blaming the entire global Jewry for something that may have happened, particularly with the government. And so we kind of have to look at that. So anti-Israel is not always anti-Semitic, but a lot of times, unfortunately, we do see that bleeding into it. And the perfect example, Shaya, when he was talking about statistics, when we look at the conflict of what happened in May of 2021. When we're talking about anti-Zionism, though, ADL, we truly believe anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. You are literally rejecting Israel as a legitimate member of the community. I'm going to repeat that. It is literally rejecting Israel as a legitimate member of the community. Of all nations, you are denying the right of Israel to exist. And so when you start seeing things like Zionism is racism, Zionism is white supremacy, Zionism is homophobia, sexism, and that's a lot of what we are seeing play out on college campuses, you are saying that Israel should not exist. So again, you can be a Zionist, you can criticize the Israeli government all you want, the policies, but when you start from the basis of Israel has no right to exist, it is truly anti-Semitic. And that's kind of how we sort of look into it. So anti-Israel, again, can bleed into anti-Semitism. It may not always be, but anti-Zionism truly at its core is anti-Semitism.
Thank you. So I think we've kind of laid down the marker for how we kind of differentiate between these three concepts and really the overlap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So I want to move now and kind of run through some scenarios with the three of you and get your take a little bit about whether these incidents were anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and how you came to the conclusion. And I'm going to assign specific scenarios to specific panelists, but I invite all three panelists to jump in and share their viewpoints, even if you're not assigned. So the first one is for Marie, and this is something you mentioned this morning at the plenary. And you talked about the car convoy that was waving Palestinian flags through a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in London, and some of the riders were chanting "Free Palestine" to the passerbyers. How did the Board of Deputies and the Jewish community generally approach that issue?
Thank you. Firstly, it was incredibly frightening. We couldn't believe on the streets of London there was a convoy with voices shouting, "Kill the Jews, rape the women." That was a complete shock. This is London. A convoy is one thing. When they went through Jewish areas, that wasn't just freedom of expression, of speech. That actually became frightening. It became horrifying, and it's clearly, in my view, anti-Semitic. It was terrorizing Jews, specifically going to Jewish areas and making them feel absolutely intimidating. I think it was an easy case of anti-Semitism because it was targeting Jews, and it was also race hatred as well, inciting people to violence and screaming, for example, free Palestine. Amongst that, as well as calling for rape of women and children, clearly shows that that's anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. It's absolutely everything. And that is incredibly frightening, that 1 minute everything is calm and it can then suddenly change, and you can see this on the streets of London. It's very, very worrying for young people. It's something that we can't fathom. So some people have been prosecuted, which they should have been, from that horrible incident. But every time there's conflict, for example, in May 2021, immediately in schools as well, Jewish children found that they were having abusive comments, people weren't talking to them, and it was very, very difficult. So conflict immediately, I'm afraid, brings out the world's oldest hate, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, hatred of Israel, but actually it's hatred of Jews, people that want to delegitimize Israel, the world's only Jewish state. And sometimes it does come to violence on the street, unfortunately.
That's a pretty terrifying scenario. We had not that extreme, but we had something similar. Many may recall on 47th Street in the Diamond District, where an anti-Israel convoy kind of drove through the streets, which are predominantly a lot of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox businessmen work there, and they threw firecrackers and shouted "Free Palestine," again targeting them solely because they were Jewish.
And these people then went down the Finchley Road and also then went into Jewish areas. So they clearly had done their research, and they were terrorizing Jews. But due to a loophole in the law, the convoy was allowed to travel because we had COVID restrictions at the time, and they wanted to have a second convoy, but the police managed to do a lot better on the second one. But that sort of thing shouldn't be happening, and it's absolutely frightening to see it in what you think is a civilized country. Suddenly behavior turns to such vile, disgusting hatred, which is clearly anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and hatred of Jews, nothing else.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so what I was going to add is to take it one step further. When things happened in May of 2021 during the conflict, what we started seeing here, and I'm sure it happened over in Britain too, but in the United States, we saw synagogues that were vandalized, and they had the word Free Palestine. And this is where I'm glad you brought up the IRA definition, because a lot of law enforcement doesn't necessarily understand. They see it as graffiti, and they didn't understand that it was potentially a hate crime, a bias incident that was anti-Semitism, because they don't necessarily understand what Free Palestine means. So you see, unfortunately, which we've also seen, a swastika maybe on a synagogue or some sort of Jewish slur, very easily recognizable, but something like in the car where people driving through yelling Free Palestine, the same thing when it's been vandalized on a synagogue. It's not just vandalism, it's not just graffiti, it is a bias incident, and that's why we've tried so hard to do education, which is why a panel like this is so important, to the distinctions, or even something like Zionist pigs, also we've seen graffitied. And so it's that important to really just understand the distinctions because of the impact it also then has on the Jewish community. It has this ripple effect for everybody when you see something like that on a synagogue or driving through the streets yelling at Jewish community.
Matt?
Yeah, I think it's important that you have to break down a scenario and really look at the details. There is no, multiple choice if this happens. Every situation is different. So when I listen to the scenario that you're laying out, okay, there are people protesting Free Palestine. Well, we know a lot of people support the right, the rights and the needs for a Palestinian state that aren't anti-Israel or aren't anti-Zionist. So that not necessarily in itself is not anti-Semitic. But you have to go deeper. Okay, where are they having this rally? Is it on Trafalgar Square, or is it going through the Jewish community? Okay, that makes a difference. Are they targeting and therefore trying to hold responsible the British Jewish community for the lack of Palestinian rights? Okay, that changes the context. Then, are they just saying Free Palestine, or are they attacking Zionists? Or are they making statements that suggest that a Palestinian state should be from the river to the sea? Are they being intimidating in what they're saying and what they're doing? All of these facts matter. You have to look at an incident and understand, and for me, where this bleeds so often is when the Jewish community of another country is being targeted as a proxy for the governmental policies of Israel. And that is where, in a way that we don't see, we don't see Russian American students being targeted on campuses for the policies of Russia. But yet Jewish students, American Jewish students, are being targeted as a proxy for the governmental policy of Israel. I believe strongly that there are many Americans who have problems with the policies of the American government, yet they're still proudly American. And I believe that you can be an Israeli or a supporter or have a connection to Israel and not necessarily be supportive of the governmental policies of Israel. And as long as people keep conflating those two, that's where you see the line between legitimate protest of policy and anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Those are all really great points, and that's actually a good segue to our next scenario. So for Meredith and Matt, several student groups at a major university collectively announced they are amending their bylaws to include a prohibition on inviting speakers who support, quote, racist or colonial policies, including Zionists. Meredith, how would ADL approach a scenario like that?
So the way we initially, so we reach out to the university usually, a lot of times students report it to us, particularly Jewish students who are now fearful for their safety on campus when they hear something like this. So that's sort of like the basic as to how it initially comes in. Most of the time these incidents, when we talk about bylaws, they are anti-Zionist, they are anti-Israel, and they are creeping into and are anti-Semitic on many of the campuses for some of the reasons that actually Matt was just specifically talking about. The thing that we truly try to do with ADL is we work on discussions with students, with university administrations. We reach out to the Hillels usually. You know, Hillels are there on campus to cultivate Jewish life. They are not here, one Hillel staff person said to me, they're not here to throw spears. They're not supposed to be, they are trying to create a welcoming environment. Shabbat services, Sukkot services, you know, anything along those lines. They don't have the expertise to be going in, and they work with ADL, but to going in and doing education and stuff. So we try to work on a lot of it behind the scenes. You don't necessarily see it all up front. We talk about how the bylaws are not just focusing on anti-Zionism or anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic, but how it's hurtful. We use words like how it's hurtful, how it's creating an unsafe, exclusionary environment for students, saying that they can't be a part of, whether they support the state of Israel or not. It is targeting Jewish students specifically. So we sometimes see the proposals also when they're put on the table is then students start facing anti-Semitic incidents right after it happens. So we've seen campuses where students have a flyer put under their door or on their whiteboards. If you have a college student, there's like whiteboards. I think they still do whiteboards, but they have whiteboards, and they come back and it says Zionist pig, the word I used before. It says Free Palestine, or even a swastika right after this happens. So it's, again, it's one thing when you want to look at, they want to look at divesting, or they want to, say that we don't want to work with the state of Israel and stuff, but we try to also focus on not just what it is, but the impact that it's actually having throughout all of the campuses and through all the different student groups that are part of the campuses and stuff. And so we've been very successful in many places, and then being able to go in and do education with the administration, with the deans, with the other faculty, with professors, with students on the historical aspects of anti-Semitism, where it was and how it's manifesting today, and why this is actually having an impact on the students.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, I think in this case, we have to recognize that Zionism is a Jewish value, and that Zionism is a fundamental belief in a Jewish state based on the religious and historical values of the Jewish people. And so when you attack Zionism or Zionists, you are attacking Jews for believing in Judaism. And so that is fundamentally anti-Semitic. And so when we see language on campus that is targeting Zionists, it would almost be akin to saying we will not welcome people who keep kosher in our program. Now, look, keeping kosher is a Jewish value. Some of us believe in it, some of us don't. But many of us, most of us, respect it as a fundamental part of Jewish law and Jewish value. Zionism is the same thing. So when we see attacks on Zionism and Zionists, it is a proxy. It's essentially saying love for Israel to connection for Israel. And we have not created an environment in which, as a Jewish community, used by those who oppose us to say, if you are a Zionist, you therefore believe and support everything that Israel is doing, and therefore you are not welcome in these spaces.
Thank you. Marie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, in the UK, I think that it would be too obvious if a university tried to amend bylaws to say that a Zionist speaker couldn't come. They might do it in practice, and if we hear that there's some sort of ban either on somebody from Israel or some Zionist speaker coming, that will lead to some public outcry. Initially, we have relations with the vice-chancellors. We keep those relationships. A lot of these things can be avoided if you have regular dialogue, so we try to do that. We would work with the Union of Jewish Students because they're on campus. They're very important because they have to live with this situation. But if we got into an absolute situation where a university was banning, for example, an Israeli speaker and it could not be resolved, there would be a public outcry, to be honest with you. That would be the way that we would do it. It would be racist. And why should a university receive public funds if it's going to have racist policies? So it would start getting very messy. I would be surprised if they would try and put this into the bylaws, because it's a lot easier just to make sure that you don't invite Jewish speakers or an Israeli speaker, and actually clocking that and realizing that's the situation is also something that's difficult in itself. But we wouldn't accept that. That would not be freedom of speech. That would be racism.
You know, I think that's in many ways one of the more challenging elements in dealing with anti-Zionism, in the sense that, you know, even if there's no bylaw written down, if it's kind of a unspoken policy of not inviting, you know, pro-Israel speakers or Jews, it's very hard to prove that to a certain degree. And I think that in some ways makes probably your work challenging. So when these student groups put it in their bylaws saying very clearly we reject Zionists, it almost makes it easier in some ways to call them out and point to their anti-Semitism. So I want to move on to a third scenario that's a little bit less clear-cut, perhaps, and I think will be an interesting conversation. And this particularly is from Marie and Meredith, but Matt, please feel free to weigh in. So a popular ice cream company, an unnamed company, announces that they plan on halting sales of their products to Israeli stores located in the West Bank, but will continue selling their products throughout the rest of the country. So Marie, do you have any thoughts on how you might approach this scenario?
We did have many thoughts in the UK. It's clearly BDS. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's singling out Israel, the world's only Jewish state, for punishment. And it's trying to put restrictions where we know that they would not be selling their ice cream, I won't say the names in case I get into trouble, into mainstream Israel. And the BDS movement is clearly, it exists only to delegitimize the state of Israel, and is purely linked to people being Israeli and Jews, and it's clearly anti-Zionist, it's clearly anti-Semitic, and it's not just anti-Israel. It's beyond that. It's trying to get other countries around the world involved in BDS to delegitimize Israel. That's really what is at the heart, in my view, of BDS. That's its aim. It's a tactic. It's discriminatory, and it's absolutely racist. The company concerned certainly knew the Board of Deputies' views. We made it very, very clear. And we wanted to make sure that this doesn't happen again to that unknown company.
Thank you. Meredith?
You know, we could have said shampoo company, candy bar company. There are a lot of different companies that I would say.
It feels very hot in here, so I was just feeling ice cream. Yes.
So, look, it's clearly anti-Israel. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, and it really depends certainly on the policies. A lot of it is tied to, I would say, ditto, and also to what Marie said. You know, it's similar to campus in the sense that we would reach out to the manufacturer, potentially the board of directors of the organization, explain to them, again, because a lot of this comes down to, you're going to hear me talk about this a lot, education and not understanding. I think somebody said, are you going to define what all of these are? That's what a lot of this comes down to. And so some of these companies, when they're out there, maybe not this particular ice cream company, but in general is how I'm going to say, you know, they don't necessarily understand how it's harmful. They don't understand that why are they only doing this to the state of Israel? Why have they not picked any other country, particularly where maybe they believe, there are some sort of policies that they disagree with the government and stuff. So it really comes down to what we're finding, particularly with anti-Israel and anti-Zionism, and it is also not necessarily, I would say, a lot of people think it's left versus right. We see it across the board. We kind of look at it. It doesn't matter which angle it is coming from. We see it coming from many different perspectives. And when you see a company that is looking this and says, well, we're not going to sell our products anymore, it's like all you're now doing is hurting the people in that country. And it is a country that exists, and they need to understand what these policies are actually doing in Israel, and why, again, they're causing essentially anti-Semitism that could be then permeating throughout the rest of the world, specifically when we're talking about this.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to?
No, I think they've done a great job.
Okay. I'm sort of picking up on a common theme here in terms of the importance of educating and explaining to folks why the positions they take are problematic, and sort of giving folks the benefit of the doubt of not necessarily understanding the impact of their actions. And, all three of our organizations, we do a lot of work on that front in terms of educating the public, and I think we've seen over the past few years how that has really become so much more significant in the fight against anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, just educating people who generally are not aware of the consequences of their actions and of their statements as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Speaking of, so the next scenario is going to be a little bit different, and I really would love the viewpoints of the three of you on this. So a group of elected officials vote against a bill calling for their government to provide funding for Israel, which would be used to purchase additional defensive weapons. Those elected officials explain that their concern is that if they provide the funding, that will contribute to prolonging the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, Matt, I want to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure, the easy one. Great.
An easy one.
Yeah.
How would you approach this scenario?
Look, I think that the language that you're hearing is around prolonging the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which suggests a disagreement with the governmental policy of Israel, is significant there. And I believe that when you have lawmakers who make that nuanced an argument and concern about governmental policy, I disagree with, and I support Israel's right to defend itself. I don't think that is inherently anti-Semitic. Now, we know, again, that the language bleeds, that it is rare that you have someone who says it in that nuanced a way and makes that distinction and doesn't do it in a way that suggests that they're putting the lives of innocent Israelis at risk, or that they are not supportive, or that they're supportive of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, but yet have concerns about borders or policies or whatever it may be. So the scenario as you lay it out to me is not anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist for that matter. It's problematic. But I think we also have to recognize that a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing on Capitol Hill from those who are opposing money to support Israel's defense are not being as nuanced as that scenario.
So thank you. Marie, coming from the UK, which is slightly different politics, how would you approach the issue?
Yeah, I would approach this slightly differently. The scenario in the question was purely for defensive weapons. So Israel was never going to be the aggressor. So we all know that Israel has the Iron Dome, and it's done a fantastic job. So my narrative is a bit different. What do these people want? More dead Jews? I think it is, in my view, anti-Semitic, because Israel is only defending itself, and it has got a right to exist. The scenario was purely for defensive weapons. It wasn't weapons for any other purpose. And why should there be more Israeli fatalities? Why should people say more Jews in Israel should die if they're trying to defend themselves? And that is the scenario. The scenario doesn't say they're going out attacking anyone. So I have a slightly different view, because the scenario was for defensive weapons. And it's a nasty narrative, and I don't see why Israel and Jews should not defend themselves.
Thank you. I think that's an important distinction. Meredith, did you want to weigh in?
So I'm kind of in the middle here of both. So we know we're talking about the Iron Dome, and which again is a defensive system, and not funding it is not going to cause the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to continue. I mean, that is just, it's been going on for. So not funding it is not going to, Warren calls Israel an apartheid state. In addition to not funding it, then clearly we are talking about anti-Semitism in Israel, who are not all Jewish. You're talking about Jews, you're talking about Muslims, you're talking about Christians, Druze, many other. It is not just, we're not just talking about the Jewish community there, you were talking about Israelis there. And so we know rockets are being launched from terrorist groups like Hamas, and we are trying to protect them there, and so it depends on the phrasing on how it's used, but we definitely, when this scenario came up, had a lot of, complaints and questions, and definitely called certain statements that they were bleeding into anti-Semitism.
So speaking of phrasing, our last scenario really focuses on that, and it's really also for the three of you. So the scenario is a popular musician who routinely promotes the BDS movement and other anti-Israel narratives has his U.S. tour canceled due to pressure put on the musician's promoter by Jewish groups. In an interview, the musician blames the, quote, Israel lobby, not the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby, for his tour's cancellation. So Marie, what would be your thoughts on that?
We've had a number of painful scenarios with musicians and rappers, I think, in the last year. This is also a horrible false narrative, the Israel lobby. It's implying that Jews, Israel, control the world. It's dog whistle for Jewish control, which clearly falls into the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I think this is very, very harmful. It's trying to, the musicians are trying to blame clearly all Jews. They might as well say Jews when they talk about the Israel lobby. And unfortunately, that is something that we are seeing time and time again, where it feeds into that dog whistle, as I say, Jewish control, Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling the world, Jews controlling banks. It's clearly anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Matt.
You have two anti-Semitic tropes playing out at the same time here. You have the idea of the Israel lobby suggesting that American Jews who are raising objections are akin to Israel. That's a trope in itself. And then I agree with Marie that the idea of Jewish power and Jewish money as controlling someone's right to perform is an anti-Semitic trope as well. So you have two of those going on right now. This is obviously analogous to what we're seeing with Kanye West, where the actions and the outrage that people are having about his comments and his actions, it's everything that he is receiving is being blamed as Jewish power, Jewish control, blacklisting him when it's legitimate criticism of what he's saying.
And I think that also, you mentioned Kanye, I think that speaks to the, the ability of anti-Semitism to sort of transcend political views and cultures, et cetera. It's, when we think of the accusation of the Israel lobby, it has traditionally come from those who are associated with the progressive left. And the example with Kanye and others shows that it's not limited to the progressive left. I would not call Kanye a progressive leftist. And so I think it really speaks to how no one has a monopoly over these tropes.
Look, we could have a whole other panel about what we've learned over the past month about how anti-Semitism is changing. I think we're seeing it in new places that we didn't see it before. Or perhaps it's coming out of shadows and more overt than we've seen before. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. But what is helpful is that I think we are seeing Jews and non-Jews more vocal in speaking out against it than I can recall in the 20 years that I've been working in this work. There is a recognition that this is a issue that the American people writ large need to address. That this is not a Jewish problem, that this is not a problem that is minor compared to other issues that are happening in our country. There is a recognition here, I think, for the first time, that this is a serious problem in our country.
Absolutely. Meredith, did you want to?
So all I would add is I think I would agree with pretty much everything. I mean, you're peddling in anti-Semitic tropes. I want to encourage everybody. We have an incredible tool called Anti-Semitism Uncovered on our website that really talks about the anti-Semitic tropes. It gives you the full definitions and why when you're talking about Jewish control, Jewish power, the Jews control Congress, the Jews control Wall Street, the Jews control all the banks, the Israel lobby, all of that, and it conflates everything. It causes more issues within the community. It causes more anti-Semitism, and particularly what Shaya was just saying with anti-Zionism, we are seeing that play out. You see it coming from white supremacist type groups, and you see it sometimes coming from the very far progressive left. And clearly there is something going on there when you see both of them sometimes burning an Israeli flag in the streets. There are pictures of people like David Duke doing that. There are pictures of certain leaders, that somebody would say is traditionally coming from the left. All of that, a lot of it then tends to peddle in a lot of what the anti-Semitic tropes are. So a musician, a celebrity, whoever it is, so I guess musicians are celebrities, but any type of fashion model, whatever, anytime you hear something like that, when they start saying that, they have 30 plus million viewers. They have this many followers, who are going around on tour with them. They are then hearing that, and they are peddling in things that are going to have an impact on Jews actually in the community and true anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add that last year we had the rapper Wiley. I don't know if you remember this, but he went on an anti-Semitic rant for about 3 days. And online is clearly the new front line in the fight against anti-Semitism. And do you know he couldn't be prosecuted in the UK for what he did, because when he was doing his work, he was in another country, and that's a loophole that's got to be closed. And that was the difficulty of this, because online it's very easy for people to be anonymous. It's very easy for people to be reached in their absolutely millions, and musicians have got an incredible social following, and people like Wiley, they're allowed to come back online. There's not really any real punishment for this. And even with Kanye, isn't it awful? He's not even sorry. It's very hard reading about this at home in the UK. You don't expect this, but it's clearly hatred of Jews. It's not just education. I think it's beyond that, but we've got a duty to try and build bridges with people, try to educate. But there are some things like Wiley, for example, in the UK, that's just too far. And I'm very pleased that Adidas and other companies have pulled relationships with these people. But it's not the fault of the Jews. It's their own actions that really count, and they need to look at themselves, and hatred doesn't pay.
So thank you. Thank you for running through those scenarios with me. Part of this panel is titled, What Can We Do? So I want to move on to the next section before we get to the questions, where I'm going to ask the three of you about a specific incident that you or your organization had to deal with and how you approached it. So Marie, first to you. Everybody knows about Jeremy Corbyn. Everybody knows that the challenges that the Jewish community face. Can you talk a little bit about how the Jewish community viewed Corbyn? Was he an anti-Semite? How did you navigate that complicated political space?
This was a really difficult time in all of our lives. I could talk all day, but Jeremy Corbyn brought anti-Semitism from the mainstream to the mainstream from the very fringes of society. It was the most frightening thing for anti-Semitism to be rife in the opposition party, the Labour Party. And eventually, complaints were made to the Equality and Human Rights Commission that investigated the Labour Party and found against them. That was a very, very low day for the Labour Party, having had allegations founded against them. And since that time, Jeremy Corbyn has what's known as lost the whip, which means that he cannot now stand as a Labour MP. He's still an MP because he was a Member of Parliament, because he was elected at the last election, but he doesn't represent the Labour Party. But although the leadership has done a huge amount to actually make sure that anti-Semitism is dealt with in the Labour Party, the culture at the local constituent level has got a long way to go. These sorts of things can take decades. This is really a very, very long journey. But the Labour Party has worked hard. It's rid themselves of a lot of these people. But unfortunately, they haven't gone away. They're just doing something else. And hatred is still there. How did we deal with this in the UK? 40% of Jews said that if the Labour Party got in to power, they would leave the UK. All the communal organisations, whatever our differences in the past, you know what it's like with Jewish organisations, we all came together for years to fight anti-Semitism. We dealt with it together as a community. Of course, there are some people on the outlying which don't represent the mainstream. But we all pooled our resources, we all worked together, and we worked globally because it's also part of a global disease. We work with ADL, we work with all our international partners. But it's not something we're going to forget lightly in the UK. But I could speak for a long time about it. It's a most awful experience. You could not imagine that this could have happened in the UK, but it did.
And it's an important lesson for us because, again, often what happens in Europe, particularly in the UK, is a bellwether for what will happen here in the United States. So it was an important lesson for us as well. Matt, so a couple of Sundays ago, if you watched football, you might have seen an ad by your foundation to combat anti-Semitism. Yes, it was a great ad. Called #StandUpToJewishHate. Can you talk a little bit about what your foundation hopes to accomplish with that?
Sure, and let me step back for a second to say that Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism was founded in 2019 by Robert Kraft and the Kraft family to really raise awareness about anti-Semitism among non-Jews and to build relationships between other communities and the Jewish community to address anti-Semitism. And we've been working very hard to roll out a campaign that we're hoping to launch in the spring to raise awareness specifically among non-Jewish communities about anti-Semitism and to have these types of conversations. But there was a moment that was happening 2 weeks ago where there was a national conversation about anti-Semitism, and we needed to we felt that there was a moment that we could take advantage of in a positive way. And so we, within 24 hours, created that ad and got it placed on NFL games. And it had an enormous response. We're very excited about that. But what was even greater is the next day I heard from the Yes Network, which airs the Brooklyn Nets games where Kyrie Irving plays, and they wanted to run the ad. And they've been running the ad. And then NASCAR reached out and they ran the ad on their races over the last weekend. And so there's a recognition, as I said earlier, that this is a conversation that needs to be had and that we need more and more people need to be speaking out about this. We are really excited. We're gonna be launching a full campaign, Stand Up to Jewish Hate, in the spring. We want everybody in the Jewish community and everybody in the country to be part of this conversation. But you know, as we build the plane, as we fly the plane, as we build it, we recognize we were in a moment where we had to speak out, and we were really fortunate to be able to have that outlet.
Thank you.
So
the question is, what is the ad about?
Yeah. So the ad was very simple. It was text on a black background, and it essentially said, "We know people are speaking out about anti-Semitism this week. We hear you, we thank you, but we need you to speak out about anti-Semitism every week, and that this is a problem that our community is facing throughout the year, and Jews are only 2% of the population of the United States. We cannot do this alone. We need support. We need people to stand up to Jewish hate." And that is going to be our message moving forward.
In the UK, just to add, we realised that people that were non-Jews didn't know what anti-Semitism was. So we actually changed our messaging, and we've called it anti-Jewish racism, because they really don't know the word. We think we do. They saw the Jews marching on the streets. We've never marched on the streets and called out anti-Semitism so much more. But we had to realise that an average person didn't know what anti-Semitism, the actual terminology is. And I think that's important to think about in our messaging.
Thank you. So we're running a little short in time, so I'm actually going to go to questions, and I'll ask the first question to Meredith. And apologies, we got a lot of questions, and so I don't think I'm going to be able to get to all of them. Obviously we're talking about anti-Zionism here. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that ADL has done with respect to anti-Zionist student groups on college campuses in particular, and how we approach them as Jewish groups, but also anti-Zionist groups?
Sure. So college campuses the dynamic has certainly changed. I am a mom of a 17-year-old heading off to college next year, so I am hyper aware, not just as somebody who works at ADL, but what is, as we're looking at schools and what feels safe and inclusionary. And so when we are seeing a lot of groups that I would not necessarily say are traditionally anti-Zionist, there are groups, and you've probably seen some of it in the news and stuff, where it's a group that works on an issue, let's just pick climate change, for example, and they are creating litmus tests whether or not students can join that organization, and the litmus test becomes, are you Zionist? Are you pro-Israel? Like, they are being almost asked that at the door and stuff. And so what we've tried to do is similar to the bylaws conversation, is going in and talking with the administration that they particularly need to make statements that this is not their values. It is not creating an inclusive environment. It is being very exclusionary. These are not groups that are set up to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It has literally nothing to do with it. There are certainly groups also that they are all for Palestinian rights, as a lot of people are in general and stuff, who are also the ones who are introducing a lot of these bylaws and things along those lines and stuff. And so what a lot of it has just come down to is the education aspect. And this is where we're approaching it is going in and giving the tools and the training for students who are part of a lot of the Jewish groups on campuses. There's the Hillel groups, the Students Supporting Israel, the SSI groups. There are several others who can go and work with the other types of groups, the ones who want to listen, the ones who want to be educated, the ones who want to better understand where things like anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Israel rhetoric, where things like anti-Zionism are causing and conflating things on campuses.
Thank you. Matt, for you, how has the inflammatory rhetoric from prominent political leaders affected this particular issue, and what can be done to combat it? So in other words, how has the mainstreaming of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel rhetoric, et cetera, affected the Jewish community, and what can we do to address it?
Well, I think what it's done is separate. It has essentially created very much the same litmus test that Meredith is speaking about on the college campuses. That there is now a checklist of what it means to be part of the progressive community. And it is very binary. You are either pro gun rights, or you are pro gun restrictions. You are either pro-choice, or you're pro-life. You are either, that's how we look at everything. You are either, pro-LGBTQ rights, or you're homophobic. You're either pro-equal rights for women, or you're sexist. We have layered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in that lens, and the language is now either you are pro-Palestinian and therefore anti-Israel, or you are a colonializer, or you are, you support an apartheid state. And so what has happened is the conversation, and this happening at the national level, is giving younger people and members of some of the organizations within our community a the freedom to do the same thing at the local level. And so what you're seeing now is this type of conversation where you cannot hold any view, specifically around Israel, that does not conform to the full agenda of the progressive movement and still expect to have a seat at the table. And that's very difficult.
There's no more shades of gray, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Marie, in your other full-time job, you're a labor lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, so this is a great question for you. Can you please speak to the best ways to address anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic microaggressions in the workplace?
So, in the workplace, well, in the UK, we have what's called protected characteristics, and we have something called the Equality Act. And in the UK, race and religion are protected characteristics and protected, not anti-Semitism. There have been cases in the past where that sort of language has been tested and there isn't an outcome. There will shortly be a decision because we at the Board of Deputies brought a case against Reverend Sizer and the church, through the Church of England, disciplinary measures. So you will actually see something. But in the workplace, we produce a guide at the board at work. And for example, people can come to us and say, I'm being told I've got to work on a Jewish festival. This is anti-Semitic. You tell my employer. But the law is in the UK that if the employer is reasonable and they really cannot accommodate this request, that is not going to be unlawful. So a lot of it is about trying to be reasonable. We have lots of questions all the time about exams, students not being able to take exams on Yom Tov, all of those things. But most UK employers will have harassment policies, good policies on diversity, and it will fall into those sorts of areas. But there isn't a specific protection for the word anti-Semitism. It comes within racism, which has to be on race or religion if tested.
Thank you, Meredith.
So what I just want to add to that, for here in the United States, what we've started seeing is a lot of companies, and I'm sure a lot of you, depending on where you work, are seeing DEI groups set up, and you're seeing employee resource groups, the ERGs. And what we've seen happening is the conversation. I've actually had somebody recently who messaged me and said, my employer won't let me set up a Jewish ERG group because they say it's a religious group. And we're saying that's not true. You actually can do that, and it is something that we encourage. And so ADL and many other organizations are going to be part of a program in December coming up called Shine a Light, which is working with a lot of our companies and corporations throughout the United States. And we really would encourage you, as part of your company's DEI efforts, or it could be in the school system too, setting up a Jewish ERG group, because that is a way to have a discussion about anti-Semitism. So when things like microaggressions, anti-Semitic slurs, or just random phrases that could potentially be anti-Semitic, so that the company itself can understand that a little bit better. And so that's a way to kind of help work through that, as to what we're seeing now permeating throughout the business world too.
Thank you. Matt, any last words? No. All right, well, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists, Marie, Matt, and Meredith. Thank you all for this conversation. Thank you, everybody on the live stream, and enjoy the rest of the day.